So welcome everyone. This is a monthly series that we do, and I'm going to be introducing our panelists tonight. And how we function is that each of our panelists are going to share about 5 minutes of their story and a little bit about their life, and then we're going to ask a few questions, and then they'll be able to jump in as they feel compelled, and then at the end y'all will be able to ask your questions as well. So we are going to start with Taylor Granroos. She is a dog lover, an amateur YouTuber, and a Native American. She went to Columbia Heights schools most of her life and currently works in a local business. So let's welcome Taylor. Yeah, you can just talk a little bit about where you grew up, about 5 minutes about where you grew up and how you came to Columbia Heights.
Okay. So I am born and raised in Minneapolis. My family is, my mom's side of the family is from Red Lake, which is a reservation very north of here. It's about 5 or 6 hours, depending on how fast you drive. My dad's side of the family is from Leech Lake, which is about the same distance, but it's more east than Red Lake is. And I've been raised like completely Native American, like from birth to, until I stopped living with my parents. But I went to, where did I go to kindergarten and stuff? Well, I went to school on the reservation for about the first 2 or 3 years of my education. So from kindergarten up until I believe like 3rd or 4th grade, I went to school in Bemidji and in Red Lake. And the schools up there are really, they're okay. They're reservation schools, and you can only imagine, like with funding and that kind of thing, it's not very good. But then I moved down here to Minneapolis, and I went to North Park, which is the elementary school north of 694. And there we had some Native American education, but not a ton. We met like maybe once a month, sometimes. And then I kind of went to school here in Columbia Heights, whether it was to the actual Columbia Heights School District or if it was the ALC that was in Columbia Heights and has now moved to Fridley. And then I lived with my boyfriend in Edina for a short period of time, and then we moved here. So I then lived in Columbia Heights again, and then I started working at the Dairy Queen, which is 2 buildings down, if you don't know the Dairy Queen. But yeah, I am like Native American, like through and through, like 100%. There's like no white or anything else mixed in. But yeah. And
what tribe of Native American are you?
I am Ojibwe, which is kind of like, it's like a really big general tribe. I am not actually enrolled in Red Lake or Leech Lake, just because it's a lot of paperwork. But I am an Ojibwe, or Anishinaabe, as some people call it.
All right, thank you so much.
That's all I had to say.
Miss Cheril Davies is going to introduce herself next. She's a citizen of the Leech Lake Band of Ojibwe and Columbia Heights resident with children in the local schools. Cheril is actively engaged in the Columbia Heights School District to help develop an Indian education program.
Anin Boujou, I'm Mr. Cheril Davies. My last name may seem a little familiar because my husband sends out flyers to everyone pretty often. He works for the city. I grew up in South Minneapolis. My mom raised myself and my 2 older good-looking brothers. I'll be nice tonight. In South Minneapolis, and in the summers, I would go to the reservation in Leech Lake and spend my summers with my grandparents. So I got a lot of my education as far as powwows, culture, language, how we're, who we are, where we come from, what our responsibilities are from my grandparents. So I was taught from a very young age how important grandparents are to Anishinaabe children, and we're to respect them. So it's always been my biggest fear to disappoint my grandparents. And I wasn't necessarily afraid of punishment growing up. It was always disappointing my grandparents. That was the biggest thing that my mom could do. She would say, just wait till I tell your grandparents. And that would straighten me up enough right there. So I grew up in South Minneapolis. I graduated from Minneapolis South High. I had my daughter when I was a teenager. My daughter is now 27. So her and I, of course, tandemly grew up together. And we moved out here to Columbia Heights in 95, I believe. Yeah, 95, 96. She started kindergarten out here, and that's when my involvement with the school districts began. And I noticed a difference in Veronica as she navigated her way through the school here, K through 12. And she would tell me these stories on how she felt invisible. She would go to school, even though she's Anishinaabe and she has every reason to feel proud. And don't get me wrong, Columbia Heights is a great place to raise students and athletic students and be proud of your culture and your heritage, but they were always kind of missing the mark when it came to Native American students. And when you look at the census, we do have a population of Native Americans here, but our students weren't staying here. They were leaving. And so when she would look around at her classmates, she would only see maybe one or two other Native American students. And she just said, everything's gone. So when she graduated, I was a little disappointed that the Indian Ed program failed to recognize Veronica. Where I come from and how I was raised in the Minneapolis public schools, we always recognized our graduates because that's our future. We didn't do that here. So it was a big void. Well, along came our son, Jesse Jr. He started kindergarten, and I thought, well, we can't have the same thing happen again. We can't continue to do this to our Indian students. So I engaged the school district, and what I found from the school district was they didn't realize that they had a problem. They had no idea. They thought everything was fine. Nobody brought the issue up to them. So after helping them realize that their students and their families were unhappy, and helping them find legitimate Indian Ed facilitators and Indian Ed program leaders, they're now starting to show an increase in their Native American student population that's staying here in Columbia Heights versus going down the road to Minneapolis Public Schools or heading over to St. Anthony or moving off to, different schools, Fridley. So I think it's worthwhile for a student to stay in their community and then learn that they're accepted and welcome here too. But that's basically my story. I've been in Columbia Heights since 95, 96 for quite a few years.
Thank you so much, Cheryl. Can you introduce your mom?
Yes, so this is my mother, Glendora Ellis.
Hi, I'm what did you enrolled in the Leech Lake tribe reservation, and I've been living here in Columbia Heights 22 years, and that's odd. Yep, that's really odd to hear. Yeah, because I lived over South Minneapolis, and we were all, like she was saying, bouncing all over here and there, living here and there, and these poor kids had to go and switch schools, and maybe half a year they're here and half a year they're at a different school. And then after she had Veronica, we moved out this way, and I like it here. It's a very nice community. And someday I'm gonna go home. Home is Onigam. You know where that's at?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. That's up by Walker. And Bemidji, if anybody kind of lost on the on the graphics or whatever. But it's very beautiful. And I always call that creator's greatest creation. It's pretty.
And where did you grow up?
I grew up in Onigam, and I moved here in 1970.
And where you grew up on a reservation?
Yeah, I grew up, born and raised on a reservation
Okay.
on Leech Lake. And hopefully sometimes here be able to give my great-grandchildren native names.
I also just wanted to say thank you so much to our three guests for coming up here. Another friend of mine, I just sent a message to her and I was like, hey, that's tonight. If you have a chance, if you can stop by. But Mary said she'd like to say something as well. So if you have just like a couple more minutes.
So I'm Mary Kunesh Podein. I'm your state representative for this district, and I'm also Native American. My family is from Standing Rock. I was elected to the House of Representatives 2 years ago. And 2 years ago, we formed the very first Native American caucus that Minnesota has ever had. So I get goosebumps every time I say that. For the first time in Minnesota history, our state legislature has enough elected Native Americans to create a caucus, a group, and we are all women. Susan Allen was the first state representative to be elected. Peggy Flanagan was the second. And then in 2016, Representative Jamie Becker-Finn and I were elected to the House of Representatives. And we're really proud to say that we have shook the House up over there. We have brought to the forefront so much of the inequities that our Native folks have faced, not now, but throughout history. And when you ask, why are some of these things, why is it like this? The generational trauma that our Native American people have lived since the white man stepped on this continent, our folks now are paying for that. And that's not something that they get over easy. It's not easy to get over the consequences of being pushed off your own land and pushed into reservations and say, you give us your land and we'll take care of you. And the federal government has never, ever taken care of them, or never, and I don't even want to use that word, taken care of, but they have never met their responsibilities and their agreements to our Native American folks. And that's what our folks have been fighting back from for hundreds of years. And every time they get a little bit of ahead, something happens. You can't practice your religion. You can't speak your language. We're going to take all your kids and we're going to throw them into a boarding school halfway across the country, and we're going to keep them there for 3, 4, 5 years. And what happens is that child comes back and they've lost that connection between parent and community and family. And that's exactly what they wanted to do. And so it's a very systematic, very intentional effort by the United States government to destroy Native American culture. But we fought hard. and we've told the stories, and we've brought each other back together in so many ways. And I think you'll notice, if you pay attention to any of the elections, we have more Native Americans running for political office than we have ever had in the United States history. And so many of them are women that have felt empowered by their communities and their families. So I missed your stories. I wish I could have heard them. I just remember my grandpa telling us all kinds of stories of growing up out on Standing Rock, and then his mom brought him here to St. Paul when he was a young boy. But I think we learn so much from stories and telling each other our own stories and listening to each other's stories. And so I just want to say thank you so much for doing this and sharing your own stories and your own knowledge with this whole community at large. Thanks much.
Thank you so much. All right. Thank you, everyone. Have a great night.
This will be recorded, so.
Yep, this will be recorded, and so you'll be able to find it on Facebook and YouTube in a couple weeks, or probably a week. All right. All right. I want to say, ask a couple questions as we go along, and then thank you so much for sharing your stories. It's so interesting to hear, especially how moving around seems to be a common theme in your stories. How were Native American values expressed in your family as you were growing up?
Native American values expressed as we were growing up. So one of the things that we did when I was growing up, now I grew up in a way different time, back in the 1900s. So, and it's way different than what's going on now because we have digital media, we have students that are so hard to get them to put down, the iPhone and things like that. But back in my days, we did a lot of different, we would talk to each other in Ojibwe, and I had the opportunity going to Minneapolis public schools. We were always offered Ojibwe and Dakota classes. So I always had an Ojibwe language teacher. And one of the things that a lot of folks don't realize is that the Ojibwe nation or tribe is a very, very large tribe, and it extends well into Canada. So before these arbitrary boundaries were there, the tribes existed, and they also have different dialects. And so my Ojibwe teachers didn't always speak the same dialect as, say, like my grandparents. And my grandparents, when I would try to engage conversations with them, especially my grandmother, she would always say, it sounds lazy. So, and we would tease each other back and forth, but it was good to always, one, speak the language, and then two, enjoy feasts and food and the commonality there. And then three, powwows have always been important. We still participate in powwows, and it's one way to come together and share stories, laughter, and then, of course, just bond and be around your community and your friends and catch up with each other.
When you talk about a powwow, can you think of something that is a similar celebration in the Euro-American tradition that might represent the kind of coming together, the size of coming together?
The Renaissance Festival.
The Renaissance Festival, okay. Okay, yeah.
Mm-hmm. I was invited to the Renaissance Festival one year, and I was like, wow, this is a big powwow.
It's white people powwow.
Yes.
Wow.
There's a lot of passion there, too. So I was impressed.
When you say the Renaissance Festival, not to tease out the analogy too much, but is there a looking back in the powwow? Is it looking back to an older time in Native American history, or is powwow also about right now?
It's both. So there are different types of powwows. There's traditional, and then there's contest. and the contest powwows, believe me, if you ever have a chance to go, because the dancers, they're professional and they bring it. And that is where you get your best dance steps for even today's dances. So if you ever heard any of the songs of today that talk about shake your tail feather, that didn't come from Little John, that came from the powwow. But yeah, it's both. It's both. It's a way to cement the heritage and the tradition and the culture, but as well as, looking forward and bringing in the new generations.
And at the powwows, they honor the vets. It's a big thing. Can
you talk a little bit more about?
I've got a lot of family that are veterans. As a matter of fact, she's a vet.
How did there come to be a large Native American community of veterans in your community?
It was just like a thing to do. They didn't have much jobs, so basically it would be going to service.
It's a population the Native American population's a population that's heavily recruited by the military. Our population is a very loyal population. This is our motherland. It's very hard to understand the complex relationship that we have with the United States government. This is our land. We love this land. We're not always in agreement with the government, but we'll fight for it.
More on the topic of the recruitment of Native American citizens here in the States. Schools and going to college and getting like a typically like career job is, I don't want to say uncommon for a lot of Native Americans, but especially if you're raised on the reservation, there's not a lot of jobs there. And if you want to get like a career job that you're expected to keep for years and years and years, you have to relocate. Like, granted, there are jobs in Bemidji and like Grand Rapids and Thief River Falls, but like those are commutes. A lot of the jobs available to Native Americans are like you work at Walmart, or you work at the casino, or that kind of thing. Going to college is also very, very uncommon for a lot of Native Americans that I know. I think I know 3 Native Americans who are in college right now, who are about my age or are in my family. And that's just because dropout rates are also just super high in Native American communities, because the drug problems and, a lot of the socioeconomic issues involved in Native American communities. But just like you said, it's just something to do that isn't dropping out, going to work at the casino or something. It's another way to like go to college, or it's another way so that you're not like involved in drugs. But it is at the risk of like you could die. But it's just one of like those options that is almost one of the only options available for a lot of Native American students and people. My brother personally was even recruited after he dropped out of school, because they were like, hey, you could go to college. We could pay for your college if you go and work in the Army. And he was very close. He went to boot camp. And then after that, he was like, I can't do this, because I don't know, the Army just isn't for everyone. But it's just something that a lot of people do because it's one of the only things they can do for a lot of Native American people.
It is a myth that there's this, unlimited amount of free money for college. It's a complete myth. That unlimited amount of money for, free schooling And if people are taking the DNA test to try and get the 26% just to get that free money, you're in for a big surprise because it's not there. It really isn't.
You're talking about money set aside for being Native.
Correct. You don't have free college just coming your way. And so like Taylor pointed out, a lot of times your college fund is by serving in the military. And honestly, that's how I paid for college. Governor Ventura said, if you want some college money, serve. So we did.
And you talked a little bit about serving as an option for growing up. When people leave the reservation or leave their home communities, as all of you have done to some degree at some point in your life, is it difficult to maintain Native American values and traditions as you move about the world, or what ways do you continue to engage those values once you're outside of your community, whether it's in the military or in public schools or in a workplace?
I find the culture, the language. You lose a lot of the language because you don't hear it as often. When I was growing up, my grandparents, that's all they talked to me was in Ojibwe. And as I've been here 20, 30 years, I can still go back up north and hear my family talking Ojibwe, and I understand them. But for me to sit and hold a running conversation with them, it isn't there. I can hear it in my head, but I can't keep up a big phrase or anything. I can say a few words, and that's what I try to do with my grandchildren and my great-grandchildren. Animals, tell them which one the animals, and stuff like that. So I try.
I feel like I'm a really good person to ask about this because I think this is a really good panel of people because we have 3 different generations here. Cheril is about my parents' age and you're about my grandparents' age. So I'm on the very young end of the spectrum. And personally, because I decided to leave, like Red Lake, I decided to leave the community when I was in middle school, I've lost a lot of culture. Granted, I can still say like some Ojibwe things. Like growing up, my grandparents used to say like all they would say, they'd be like "Gaween," and then like they'd like slap my hand, and I'm like if I was doing something bad, which Gaween means no, it means like don't do that, like stop doing that. And I remember like some of those things, but it's still very hard for me to like if somebody is trying to like even tell me animals, like a lot of my younger cousins who still live on the reservation can understand those things, and I'm just sort of like a deer in the headlights. I have no idea what they're saying. And in terms of like being my age and not being very involved with my family in general, a lot of the other culture things like dancing, I did a lot of dancing as a child when I still lived with my family, but now that I'm older, I don't. I don't think I've been to a powwow in like 3 or 4 years. Just because they're not inaccessible. It's just I almost like
Well, in May
yeah.
at Highland.
I feel like when you leave the community, like the very close-knit community of your family on the reservation, you lose a lot of it just because, like you said, you're not exposed to it. And then as you're growing with age and you're like doing your own thing, you're doing something that isn't involved with your culture, you just sort of start to forget things over and over again. And it's like, yeah, I can say a few things. I understand like a lot. I remember the stories. I remember the core values: respect your elders, be kind to the earth, and the earth, will be kind to you in turn. But the thing is when you, in my experience at least, when you leave the community and you try to I don't want to say like better yourself almost, like you come to the cities to go to school, The Indian education is very lacking here as opposed to up north. You just lose a lot of it over and over, as the years go by. You just kind of, you forget. And while the core values are still there, everything else is gone. I'm routinely made fun of by my family. They say I'm the whitest Native person they know. Yeah, because I try really hard to keep steady jobs, and I just don't talk to my family very often because of the way I was raised and the way I was treated, which is just another story entirely. But I have given up.
Would you be willing to share that story?
Yeah, I mean, I could. But more on the topic is just that it's just, I don't know. I forgot what I was saying. But yeah, it's just sort of you lose a lot of the culture living here in the cities because unless you're tight-knit with a lot of other Native Americans in the area, it's just not something you're exposed to, in my experience. Almost all of my family lives up north. So, not being with them has really been detrimental to my life and my culture.
Can I ask a question?
Yes.
So, you're not a mother yet, right?
No.
So can I ask you a pointed question? When you're a mother, will you want your child to be reunified with your family so that those traditions can continue?
Let me ask the question again. So, when you have kids, are you interested, Taylor, in reunifying with your community and with your family in order to sort of help foster that in your children?
I think that's a really good question, and I think because my relationship with my family is very complicated. Again, based on my upbringing and the relationships I have with them now, I think I would like to, but it would be very tough unless I wanted to relocate to be much closer to my family, which is really difficult because we were talking earlier, but housing up north is very hard to find, and finding good jobs to support a big family or anybody is also very difficult. So in short, I would like to, but it would be difficult.
And this is something that I would really love to hear from each of you, and I imagine that you have very different answers based on your generations, but where have you personally experienced racism and cultural misunderstandings against Native Americans, both growing up and now as an adult?
Would either of you like to start?
Well, I feel like I experience racism pretty regularly. And I just feel like that happens regularly just because of a lot of times the political climate that we have currently. So it's made me more aware. Sometimes it's hard for me to decipher, is that rudeness or is it racism? So I'm really having a hard time teetering on that. But the things that kind of stand out to me when I was a young girl and I experienced racism that was very, very blatant for the first time was on the reservation. We went swimming down at the local lake, and I didn't realize that it was a resort, and the resort owner came out and hollered a lot of racial slurs and told us to leave, and it was his property, and I had no idea that it was his property. But we were 7 and 8 years old, and that's how an adult male approached 7 and 8-year-old girls, 3 7 and 8-year-old girls. Right, so that's primarily what owns resorts in Leech Lake is white folks. So, and it was a shock to me, and I hadn't experienced that before, and it really stuck out in my mind. Why would an adult speak to a child that way? So, it's that one experience has always stuck to me. As well as, just kind of navigating through life and going through school and watching how people are treated differently You know, when people are approached differently, you know, you can see it, you can feel it, and you always feel that elephant in the room. You're like, yeah, you know, if they looked differently, they probably wouldn't have been approached that way. But as far as racism, currently in my line of work, I feel like it's more sexism I experience. I work in the IT industry, and it's a lot of male ego. I'm sorry to say that, and I almost kind of don't want to say where I work, but it's a lot of male ego. And when we get into those meetings, you know, you really have to force your way into that conversation and get your foot into that door. So it's not an easy thing to do, and especially being in this body. So whatever.
My first encounter with racism was when I was in high school. I had this girl, she was a white girl, following me around and calling me the B word and stink native and all this other racial slurs thrown at me. And finally I had it, threw my books down and beat her up. and then I ended up having to go to court. I got charged with assault. But my grandpa was like the wise guy. He was our people's lawyer, and he did all this, and he knew about filling out taxes, and he was pretty old. And so he was my lawyer, and then he went and talked to the judge and told the judge what I had told him when I got in trouble at school, and turned around. She is the one that got in trouble. So told her never to say that to a native ever again. And so that was my first encounter, and I've had other few sly remarks like, "Oh, why are you driving a 15-year-old car when you guys are all rich?" and stuff like that. We're not rich. We don't get per cap payments. Yeah, that actually get per cap payments, and because there's like, I'm gonna say at least about 20,000 Ojibwe, and we've got 4 or 5 casinos, and by the time they pay all their bills and everything else, and what are we gonna get, a quarter piece? So we're not the rich ones. Neither is Red Lake either.
Again, I almost feel underqualified to speak on like an issue like this. But like I said, my family does say I'm like the whitest Native person in the family, and that's because my appearance, I do not ever get Native American. I have never experienced racism because I'm Native American, ever. Maybe like a few times, like kids in middle school are like, so you're Native, and they're like, oh, so you have like a Native American name, but it's mostly just ignorance, and they're not saying like, oh, go back to the res, you know, like they're not saying stuff like that. They're just saying ignorant things because they're children. But I don't really experience much racism personally, but I attribute that to the fact that my last name is very white sounding. When I apply for jobs, people never assume I'm Native American. They never assume I'm anything. When people ask my race, they either think I'm some sort of East Asian or that I'm Hispanic. And I have never gotten a single person guess correctly and ask if I'm Native American, ever. Not in my whole life. there have been like a few things that people do, and it's not racism, it's just kind of annoying when when I finally say like, yeah, I'm Native American. A lot of white people are like, yeah, my grandma is Native American, or they're like, and I have had, this is a joke, I joke with my family all the time about this, they're like, my great aunt was a Cherokee princess. Or, like, I've had a few people actually say that to me.
And how does that make you feel when people say that?
It's really annoying, because I'm like, granted, yes, your grandma might be part Native American, but you are white. You have been raised white your whole life. Your dad's white. Your mom was white. You live in the suburbs. You have never experienced any sort of culture beyond, like, maybe your grandma said miigwech once to you, or that kind of thing. I think the most annoying thing for me in this kind of situation is for people to assume that because I'm Native American, and that because there is some tiny, tiny part in them that is Native American, they can somehow relate to Native American struggles, or that they get to say, or that they get a word.
Be the sounding board.
Yeah, like they get to have an opinion on actual Native American issues. But otherwise, I am a very poor person to say this kind of thing just because of my appearance and my last name. It doesn't happen for me. And I kind of don't tell people that I'm Native American, not because like I don't want people to know, but because I'm just sort of like, I don't want to go through the conversation of them saying like, oh, what tribe are you? What clan are you from? And, very just typically like ignorant. Yeah, a lot of like very ignorant questions, and I'm like, I don't want to go through with that, so.
What are some better questions that we could ask when we meet a Native American person?
Is just to say, I wouldn't say if there are any questions, we're just another culture in the United States. Granted, we were here first. I'll say it. We were here first. Just say, oh, that's so cool. You can ask better questions like cultural questions. I don't know any off the top of my head, but saying, yeah, I'm like 1/16 Native American is not the right way to go about it. Definitely like not bringing up like drug problems. I've gotten that a few times too.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, they're like, oh, is your family on drugs?
Name off all the different Native American people you know either?
Oh yeah, that happens all the time when people are like, oh, I know this Native American person. Do you know them? And I'm like, no. You understand that the Native American community in Minnesota is very large. I've had my dad tell me like, hey, this is your cousin. And I'm like, I have never met this person before in my life. What do you mean they're my cousin? So it's like saying, it's kind of not on the same level, but it's like the same as like saying like, oh, I know another gay person. Do you know them? Like, you wouldn't do that. So you wouldn't do that with a race, that kind of thing.
I think sometimes white people, in an attempt to connect, try to minimize difference or create sort of even imaginary bridges between people.
I think a good icebreaker is to sometimes ask how to say different words if they know any native languages or native language. I think it's a nice icebreaker, and perhaps share how to say that word back in your language. For instance, like cat. If you ask a native person, do you know how to say cat in your native language? Well, this is how we say it in our language. I mean, those are nice icebreakers, and minimizing differences and things like that, and how to do greetings. Those are always nice topics to talk about.
One thing we talk about is, where are you from? And then, but not, one bad habit that I see people sometimes having is when you say, where are you from? And then they say Brooklyn Park. Then they're sort of not satisfied with that. And they're like, but where are you from? They're like, Brooklyn Park. And letting people be from where they are. And not always assuming that someone's from somewhere else or from a different country or... So I wanted to open up for some questions. We've got about 10 minutes. I'm going to walk out and hand the microphone so the people who are listening online can hear.
Well, you mentioned that it was nice to start off by learning a greeting, and so is that how you started? You said bijou or something? How do you say it? Bonjour. Okay, so if I wanted to greet an Ojibwe, I could say bonjour. Bonjour.
You could say either ani or bonjour.
Okay.
So bonjour is a derivative of the French bonjour.
Can you say it so in
Okay. Bonjour is a derivative of the French word bonjour. The Ojibwe or Anishinaabe did a lot of heavy fur trading with the French before Minnesota was a territory. So just like the English language has taken on a lot of slang and a lot of different terminology, the Ojibwe language did as well. So we adapted a lot of different greetings too. So bonjour.
And we don't have a word for goodbye, because goodbye means you're passing on, and you're not going to see anybody again. So we don't have a word for goodbye. And we say gigawabaman, that means I'll see you again.
Can you say that again?
Gigawabaman.
So 2 years ago at Metro State, they offered a lot of Native American classes, and so I went to them, and they offered a scholarship for me to go up to Cloquet to the Ojibwe language camp. And so I just want to encourage anybody that's here it's in July, and you can start Googling it, it'll come up, but it's free, and they do teach you language, and they teach you how to carve out turtle symbols, and the elders teach you this. And even some of us wanted to write the stories, and then one of the elders came to us and said, you cannot write their story unless you get the permission. So we were taught a lot of tradition. All the food was traditional, but it was exceptional. Exceptional.
Other questions?
So most of the natives in Minnesota, are they Ojibwe, or are there other tribes in Minnesota?
I think a very, very large portion is like Ojibwe or Anishinaabe, but I also know that the Lakota community is very large here. Yeah, that's what I believe, is that it's very diverse, but in my knowledge, it's Anishinaabe and Ojibwe are very, very large here.
I have a question. So I live in South Minneapolis, and right now there is a large Native encampment outside of the Little Earth Reservation. It kind of within, but right near.
That's not a reservation.
Oh,
They're called the project. That's the projects. It's a housing system.
oh wow.
It's a housing development, and it's mostly Native populated.
Okay.
But it's not a reservation.
Okay, thank you for correcting me. And there's a lot of conversation right now about that community and homelessness. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the unique things that lead Native American homelessness to be such a rampant issue, or can cause homelessness in the Native American community uniquely.
Well, I think a lot of it has to do with the prices of rent. It's you make $8 an hour. Okay, you can't go and rent a place that is charging $1,200 a month and still cover your lights and food and clothes for your kids and transportation and whatnot. So I think a lot of it is just the price of the rent.
Also, I don't know if a lot of folks realize that Native Americans in general haven't started to save up for home buyership. Like my mom shared her story that she left the reservation back in the 70s. Well, when they got here in the 70s, they had probably, I don't know, $200-300 in their pocket. And then, like she said, if even that. And then after that, you're working low-paying jobs. There's not a lot of prospect back in the 70s and the 80s. Of course, things have changed since then. But when you're thinking about a single woman who's living in the city, off the reservation, who has young children, unmarried, how much savings do you think that person is going to do? And likewise with a Native American male. So now that generation is a bit older, and they have my generation, who of course now has children. Often there just hasn't been chances to do the savings for home ownership. So what happens quite often is that families double up. And I don't know if anyone's ever done this in their life, but when you live in a very small home with multiple generations, not everyone gets along. So very often, quarrels happen, things like that. Somebody will instantly say, you know what, I've had enough of this. I've been doing this for a couple of years. I would rather leave this house and go live down there, homeless, than stay here any longer. That's one synopsis of what could happen. But then, of course, we all are aware of the opioid problem. That's one way that someone could arrive to that.
Something that people have mentioned, and I'm hearing again what you're saying is the accumulation of generational wealth is not there in Native American communities. The way that white Euro-American folks are able to pass down money for college, be able to pass down savings, property, the knowledge about how to get property, and that's not being passed down the same way in the Native American community, it sounds like. The other question too that I was wondering about is, with the opioid addiction, is there a unique element in the Native American community that makes them uniquely susceptible to addiction?
In my personal experience and in my family and what I know about my family, there's a lot of undiagnosed mental illness that goes into it, and this is the same for a lot of a lot of white people, is that mental illness undiagnosed can cause a lot of problems. It can cause a lot of addiction, and it's the same for the Native American community. But while mental illness for white people is very it's easy to get medication. It's easy to get diagnosed because a lot of like white families have access to those kinds of things. And I'm not saying everybody does, but a lot of families do, especially nowadays with kids who are my age. That just doesn't happen in Native American communities ever. I don't know anybody in my family who's ever been professionally diagnosed with any sort of mental illness, and I want to say a large majority of my family struggle with addiction because of it, because there's just a lot of issues that they can't deal with because they don't have the skills, because they just ignore all their problems, and then they just turn to addiction, and then it just sort of gets out of hand, and then there are no resources, especially on the reservations, to help with these problems. This is my experience with it, and the experience that I've seen with my family. But in my family, that's the big problem, is there's a lot of mental illness and a lot of health problems that my family struggles with that they just can't get diagnosed, and so they turn to opiates or drugs for like pain relief or that kind of thing, because they can't. Yeah, alcohol, weed, everything. Like they just sort of turn towards that because it's the cheaper option than going to a hospital where you can't pay for it. You turn to these things.
And then they, on the reservation, they also have this little organization called IHS, Indian Health Services. And a lot of the medical professionals that are employed there are usually medical professionals that probably wouldn't make it here in the Twin Cities. So those medical professionals would rather quickly write out a prescription and get that person moving than actually sit down and perhaps cure somebody. So it's very quick to get an opioid prescription at IHS versus being here in the Twin Cities and then having a comprehensive, health diagnosis with maybe like a cardiologist or, a mental health worker.
Thank you so much for sharing. I know it's that's a lot to share, and so I appreciate your honesty and your candor.
Is there a slide deck?
Yes, would you like to? Cheryl put together a little quiz about Native American populations that we'd love to go through.
All right, so this presentation was done for the Columbia Heights Encore class, the Columbia Academy Encore class this past spring. So Encore is an after-school program, programming that's done, and it was offered for the Native American students this past spring for the semester, and then it's going to be opened up. Also at the high school this year, which they did garnish a lot of interest for, we now have a social studies class that's Native American centric, and the students are able to take field trips to Badote, which is a Dakota and Ojibwe immersion school in South Minneapolis. They're getting speakers in, so Columbia Heights Public Schools likes the idea that we are so close to Minneapolis and we have a plethora of resources there. Instead of reinventing the wheel, let's just bring them out here. So it's just much easier to do that. But this one here is, how much do we know about Native Americans? And the first slide is, what is the name of the oldest well-preserved mummy found in Turtle Island? So Turtle Island is what Native Americans refer to for North and South America. And if you look closely at North America and South America, it kind of represents a turtle. So that's how we refer to North and South America as Turtle Island. We have creation stories that talk about we were put here. We didn't migrate here. Mm-hmm. So,
was that creation story before you had the satellite images?
That was way before that.
So you didn't know that it looked like a turtle?
I think it might have even been before the 1900s.
Wow.
Yes.
That's amazing.
Absolutely. So, there's several different options here, and then if you want to go to the next slide, the naturally mummified body of, and I'm going to not pronounce this person's name correctly, also known as the Canadian Iceman, was found in, I'm not going to pronounce that correctly, by a group of hunters in 1999. But the radiocarbon dating of nearby artifacts suggests that the body is between 300 and 550 years old. So, as you can see, Native Americans have been on this side of the world for a very, very long time. All right. In what year did Native Americans gain U.S. citizenship? So, we have a picture of code talkers, and then Native American recruits being sworn in during the Civil War. Our options are 1776, 1863, 1924, and 1964. And you guys can just guess in your head. And the answer is C, 1924. So Native Americans have not been citizens of the United States for more than 100 years.
When did we get to vote?
Why are you going through my PowerPoint so fast? Right behind the, well, gone. Right behind the Code Talkers are the Native American Women Warriors Honor Guard. These women all served in the military as well, and they do a lot of different presentations. We're hoping to perhaps have them at the Columbia Heights annual powwow for the public schools. What military service exemptions are there for Native Americans? So when we talk about exemptions, we're talking about the possibility of we can claim an exemption and say we're not going to serve. We have all Native Americans, regardless of residence, are exempt from military service. B, none tribal members have the same service obligations as other U.S. citizens. Or C, Native Americans living on a reservation are not required to register for mandatory service. If we were to see that, our answer is B. And the pictures that I have displayed here are Lori Paistawa. She was a U.S. soldier who died in combat in Iraq. She was a mother. And then down below is an iconic image from the raising of the U.S. flag at Iwo Jima. And involved in that was a Native American soldier by the name of Ira Hayes. True or false? Army helicopters are named after Native American tribes. That's true. And the reason why we do that is the Army helicopters and fixed-wing aircrafts bear names that reflect fierce and courageous warriors who also have fought as well as part of the United States Army. That is a legacy worth remembering and honoring with some of the Army's most prominent systems. So that is the official statement from the United States Army. Legend has it the Apache war hero Geronimo earned his name by attacking Mexican soldiers who fired at him with bullets. How is his name used today? A, by American paratroopers when they jump out of planes. B, as the name of towns in Oklahoma and Arizona. C, as a #1 hit song in Australia. Or D, all of the above. D, all of the above.
Do Native Americans like that these are the uses of that name?
I think we've come to terms with it.
High praise.
So Geronimo has a large, I don't want to say shrine, but what is another word? Memorial. Yeah, thank you, Taylor. Down at Fort Sill, Oklahoma. He was a prisoner there before he passed away, but he was well regarded. There are 326 reservations in the United States. Which is the biggest in terms of land? A, Yakima Indian Reservation in Washington State. B, Navajo Nation in the Southwest. C, Cheyenne River Indian Reservation in South Dakota. Or D, Wind River Indian Reservation in Wyoming. All four, very beautiful. Try to visit those nations at some point in your life. And the answer is B, which is Navajo Nation. Navajo Nation is the largest reservation in the U.S. It spans more than 27,000 square miles across Arizona, New Mexico, and Utah. And it has over 300, if you go to the next one, there we go. What I was trying to depict here is that it's in the four corners. It has over 300,000 enrolled members. And of those 300,000 enrolled members, about 170,000 actually live there. And what you also see, which is an interesting relationship, inside of Navajo Nation is Hopi Nation. So it's a nation inside of a nation inside of a nation. Okay. Native Americans were the first to pop popcorn. Make maple syrup and bake cornbread. Which Native American dish draws its history from the controversial long walk deportation from Arizona to New Mexico? Yucca, fry bread, bison, or quinoa? And our answer is B, fry bread. So with the provisions that were provided to those natives that were deported and walked across the land, they made this beautiful fry bread. Many common words draw their names from Native American languages. Which is an example? A, Chicago, B, Moose, C, Minnesota, or D, all of the above? Yes, you guys are whizzes. If we move on to the next one. You can see here Dakota people are at the Minnehaha Falls circa 1860. That's what it used to look like. That's pretty cool. Which sport owes its origins to Native Americans? Lacrosse, football, rugby, or curling?
Lacrosse.
You got it. So lacrosse is born out of I want to say the Oneida Nation, because the story was shared with me. And prior to that, before using their little rubber ball, they would use sparrow heads, the little skull, and then flip that around. All right. Which is the highest elected office ever held by a Native American? Mayor, governor, senator, or vice president? I know we're getting ready to have a soon lieutenant governor as a Native American.
Mayor?
All right. Vice president. And that is under President Hoover. Of the states listed below, which was the last to grant voting rights to all Native American citizens? Colorado, Utah, Texas, or Arizona?
Utah.
Colorado. So, although Native Americans were granted natural or national citizenship in 1924, several states limited our rights to vote. Their argument was that we were under guardianship. So Arizona denied reservation residents the right to vote until 1948, so did Utah, until 1957, and Colorado until 1970. So Native Americans have only been able to vote there for 58 years. What? Oh, yes, 40. I haven't ate yet, Pastor Bill. Sorry. What year was it made legal for Native Americans to openly practice our culture and religious rights? A, 1924, B, 1934, C, 1954, or D, 1978? Take a gander. And our answer is D, 1978. Prior to that, Native Americans had to hide to participate in Kiva, to participate in sweat lodges, to participate in powwows. Powwows were outlawed. Sundance. All of these coming of age rites and ceremonies that were so important to people, they were all outlawed.
What was the rationale? Was it fear?
There was a national policy of assimilation. As soon as Native Americans could forget their heritage, then you wouldn't have a Native problem any longer. Generally, Native Americans are exempt from which taxes? Now, this is a big one because a lot of folks have kind of misperceptions and misconceptions on what we pay for taxes. Property taxes on non-reservation lands, state sales taxes on purchases made off the reservation, state income tax on money earned on a reservation, and all state and federal taxes. Which ones am I exempt from? All right. And yeah. And so there's our check, IRS till, with all my money. And our answer is definitely C. You guys are correct. Which means if I lived on a reservation and made money on a reservation, I would be exempt from state taxes. Federal taxes, I'm still obligated to pay. Roughly, what percentage of Native American population does not live on reservation lands? And this is a common scene from,
That is from Little Earth
correct.
in South Minneapolis, which is not a reservation.
It is not a reservation. So reservations are different, that they have a treaty between the U.S. government and a tribe. A, 25%, B, 50%, or C, 75%. What percentage of Native American populations do not live on the reservation?
See.
Yes. The answer is C. So with that being said, that's a lot of property taxes and taxes that are still being collected from Native Americans. Although we do not own property, we're still paying a lot of sales tax. We're still paying our fair share of taxes. So it's always been my theory that there's a market there. There's a reason why there's a housing shortage on reservations. There's a reason why. Because if we lived on a reservation, then we wouldn't be obligated to pay state taxes.
Attention library patrons.
That's
The
all.
time is 7:45.
And I believe that's the last one.
The library will close in 10 minutes.
Well, let's say thank you so much to our panelists.
So save your work and print
Yep.
whatever you need to. The library will open again tomorrow at 9 o'clock.